Hey guys, welcome back to Listen Chum for the second part of my video on the Vietnam War. If you haven't seen the first part, I force you to watch it, because the war didn't begin with the Americans, and many mistakes that led to the ultimate failure of the war were made before 1965. Beginning in 1965 would be like beginning Lord of the Rings here. It looks cool, but we don't really get what's happening. Here we'll talk about the arrival of American troops, the Rolling Thunder bombing campaign, of both sides' strategies, of the many mistakes made on both sides, and of course the Tet Offensive. There is a very large difference between the common perception of the war and what really happened, because it was really politicized. So I'll tackle myths around the nature of the war, the idea it was impossible to win, of the old image of American troops using conventional methods against guerrillas wearing sandals, of the domino theory, of Rolling Thunder, and of General Westmoreland, to name only those. I'll also focus on South Vietnam, which is often ignored by most contents on the war, but at the end it was the center of the war. The arrival of the North Vietnamese 305th Division and other units in the south in early 1965 put in jeopardy the situation for the stretched South Vietnamese. Westmoreland received on February 19 permission to use American air power, which prevented a defeat. The Viet Cong were receiving automatic weapons, mortar and rocket launchers by land and sea and became better equipped than Southern soldiers. The Americans responded with Operation Market Time, which blocked almost all maritime infiltrations. President Johnson remained convinced by his advisors that the Viet Cong were self-sufficient and refused recommendations to go further and cut supplies passing through Cambodia and by the port of Haiphong in the north. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh and Le Duan believed the time had come to finally destroy the Arvin in the summer and fall before the Americans could react, and show the example to international communism by defeating American aggression, as they said. North Vietnam was receiving 10 times more Soviet aid than in 1964 and now boasted modern planes and anti-air missiles. China also supported, notably with 221,000 rifles and 114 million bullets that year. In private, however, the Soviets wanted to avoid a decisive northern victory and a Chinese prestige gain. Mao said the Chinese army wouldn't go to Vietnam. China only verbally protested against American air operations on the north, but Johnson never capitalized. The US administration feared a repetition of Korea and wanted at all costs to avoid provoking the Chinese. Mao realized this and became more involved in the North Vietnamese war effort, notably with troops involved in logistics work to free North Vietnamese troops for combat. They wanted to compete with Moscow. The first American troops openly involved, 2 Marine battalions, landed in Da Nang on March 8 to help stabilize the situation. The Phan Huy Quat government continued to accept every concession asked for by T. Quang's Buddhists to avoid the new 1963, and the military situation was at its worst in the war. The communists progressed in the countrysides, and the peasants didn't have any choice but to rally to them. Because of the military and political problems, Taylor, McCone, and the Joint Chiefs asked for intensifying Rolling Thunder to prevent northern reinforcements, but President Johnson showed a complete lack of military knowledge. He even asked Secretary McNamara, "I don't guess there's any way, Bob, that through your small planes and helicopters, you could spot these people and then radio back and let the planes come in and bomb the hell out of them?" He wanted to avoid sending combat troops, but military leaders told him he should expect a 5-year campaign with about 500,000 men, which proved pretty truthful. He decided to send men in dribs and drabs on McNamara's council, and always wanted to avoid publicity on this. Hanoi asked as a prerequisite to any negotiation that the US withdraw and topple the South Vietnamese government, so in short, losing. With signs of the northern offensive to come, the president chose the weakest option given to him for increasing troops. The number of American soldiers went from 33,000 to 82,000 in May, at the beginning of the communist offensive. Contrarily to the perception saying it was a guerrilla, it was more conventional war with modern weapons. There were 150,000 communist troops in the south at the beginning of the year. They began in Phu Long on May 11 with the equivalent of a division equipped with artillery. Fear of dominoes increased in 1965 and the theory was vindicated. US allies in the world, notably the Saudis and the West Germans, said they were glad the US confronted the communists. An argument brought against the domino theory is that the countries in the region didn't fall with South Vietnam's downfall in 1975, while firstly Laos and Cambodia fell, and the situation in 1975 was different than in 1965. In the meantime, there was Sukarno's downfall in Indonesia, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the widening of the Sino-Soviet split, the détente between Nixon and the two communist powers, and the wars in Indochina. China, notably after all this, felt less like combating American influence in the region. In 1965, China progressed, Indonesia was becoming a communist ally, and there were pro-China insurgencies in Thailand, Malaya, Laos, and Burma. Prince Sihanouk of Cambodia drew closer to the communists and let supply pass through Vietnam through his territory. Indonesia was in a capital geostrategic position, with shipping routes and a large population. Sukarno openly forced his country towards socialism and said to be allied with China and North Vietnam. Events in Vietnam influenced the Indonesian situation. Indonesian generals were disappointed by American half measures and clearly stated that the country's orientation would depend on events in Vietnam. They said that Asia respected power, not weakness or a lack of will from the strong. It was American show of will which motivated them to resist communization attempts later in the year and topple Sukarno. In the Indo-Pacific, the Americans were supported by Thailand, Malaya, Taiwan, South Korea, Burma, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and India, all of whom feared communist expansion and supported the American effort. The domino theory was a legitimate worry at the time. Meanwhile, the situation in Saigon was getting worse and worse. The communists struck small units and systematically ambushed southern reinforcements. The 304th North Vietnamese Division was on its way to the south. In Dong Xoai, near Saigon, the Viet Cong attacked with heavy weapons and flamethrowers. Washington finally gave Westmoreland the green light for US regulars to participate in the fighting. Prime Minister Quat announced his resignation amid a political crisis on June 11, and much to T. Quang's chagrin, power went to Nguyen Cao Ky and Nguyen Van Thieu. They finally dismissed T. Quang's influence to focus on the war. Thieu is a very interesting case, and as we'll see was a key player in the transition from a military regime to a constitutional republic, but anti-war militants treated him as a corrupt and repressive dictator. Thieu sought to triumph over the enemy, and recognized by experience that the negotiated peace was a slippery slope. He wanted at the same time to establish a modern, developed, and democratic state. His policies would be both incremental and revolutionary, but that was for later. Right now, power was shared. At the end of June, the communists had incapacitated the equivalent of 2 southern divisions. They still thought the Americans wouldn't intervene. While Westmoreland said more troops were needed, McNamara argued that Rolling Thunder would dissuade Hanoi from sending more reinforcements. The MACV commanders said that large enemy units should be targeted. Contrarily to critics of conventional war who accused him of focusing solely on that, Westmoreland wanted to break up enemy units mainly to facilitate pacification. President Johnson continued ignoring military advice. Former President Eisenhower told him that if he was getting involved in the conflict, he should commit fully. Johnson didn't like any option and was indecisive. He agreed to troop increases, but rejected calls for mobilizing reserves, increasing Rolling Thunder bombings, and mining North Vietnamese ports. Even then, he still wanted to minimize the war, in large part to protect his domestic program The Great Society, and because he wanted to keep the option of withdrawing. At that moment, he only wanted to stabilize the South, even if only to abandon it the next year, according to him, without negative consequences internationally. He said in private to McNamara that it wasn't his initial intention for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and that they didn't like this option. Even though it was a major policy change, he said the opposite in public. What pushed him to send troops was the imminent disaster in South Vietnam. What ultimately hampered these efforts was his rejection of very feasible options in Laos and North Vietnam, the result of fear and ill-placed confidence in members of his administration. The question of American strategy is extremely important because it was one of the main factors in explaining America's failure. As a reminder, there's a distinction between strategy and tactics. Strategy being guidelines for a war or a campaign, the macro level, and tactics being specific to battles, the micro level. From a logistical and tactical point of view, the Americans succeeded pretty much everywhere. At the height of the war, they transported, fed, and supplied 1 million men who entered and left the country. On the ground, American forces constantly beat North Vietnamese or Viet Cong forces. At the end, North Vietnam came out the winner. Why? One of the big reasons is the lack of a proper strategy and objectives. So not establishing clear objectives, explaining them to the American people, and establishing a victory strategy in consequence. There's a saying that we prepare for the last war, but most of the time this is wrong. For Vietnam, the Americans didn't learn the lessons of Korea and were rather preparing for imaginary wars, with a focus on nuclear notably. Johnson prioritized his domestic reform program, the Great Society, and saw the war as a distraction. He always wanted to minimize it and never tried to mobilize the people behind. They treated this as a police action and tried to do in cold blood what can only be done in hot blood. The Secretary of Defense McNamara said at the time that Vietnam was a demonstration that we could wage war without mobilizing popular support. The President probably could have obtained a declaration of war in August 1964, but settled for a Congress resolution. At the beginning, the government didn't consider a long war and only thought about protecting bases and bombing the North to make it stop its aggression. A large factor in American shyness was the fear of nuclear war and a Chinese intervention in the war like in Korea. But as we saw, neither Moscow or Beijing were ready to go to war against the Americans over Vietnam. While North Vietnam was fighting an Indochina war and established bases in Cambodia and Laos, the Americans were restraining themselves to Vietnam because of the two countries' official neutrality. It gave the North Vietnamese an enormous advantage and was a major factor in their victory. The American government didn't properly understand the nature of the war. For the first time, social sciences and nuclear theories, and not military expertise, determined strategy. Since 1945, the army was neglected in favor of nuclear armaments. Since the 1960s, there was a fantasy around the challenge of guerrilla and insurgencies, with counterinsurgency theories without the society transformation stuff, which were imposed on the military. Those who did not conform were sidelined, as it happened to Army Chief of Staff Decker under Kennedy. The Army's role was mostly seen in terms of nation building rather than applying force to defeat an enemy. In the end, Decker was right. The Viet Cong were beaten by conventional forces, and North Vietnamese conventional forces won in 1975 with 22 divisions, not by winning the hearts and minds of the people. Former chairman of the JCS, Taylor, said the Americans didn't want to defeat the North Vietnamese, but to make them mend their ways. Armed forces were treated as means of sending signals rather than means of war. Theories from thinkers like Osgood and Schelling, embraced by members of McNamara's team, spoke about winning without combat. The Whiz Kids, as they were called, thought academic theories to be superior to soldiers' experience and judgment, which were harder to quantify. This was illustrated when Assistant Secretary of Defense John McNaughton told 7th Air Force Commander Moore in a condescending way that Soviet anti-air missiles in North Vietnam were only signaling from the Russians to appease Hanoi, and that by not destroying them, it would signal to the North Vietnamese not to use them. 2 weeks later, an American plane was shot by one of the missiles, the first of 112. They didn't differentiate between Revolutionary War, which aims to win by itself, and guerrilla, which aims to weaken the enemy and prepare for a conventional war. There were always those who tried to put Vietnam in the Revolutionary War mold, and said that the failure was not applying counterinsurgency enough. This point of view subscribes to North Vietnamese claims that it was a popular war in the South, and that the North Vietnamese army was only its extension. McNamara and his team had a rationalist, universalist vision. They wanted to apply economic models with minimum inputs to produce a maximum of outputs with all the rational actors to war. Reality was different. Enemy decisions could surprise, which happened very often, and often frustrate plans. President Johnson lacked confidence in military leaders, seldom consulted them, and sometimes openly insulted them. Congress meanwhile didn't offer alternatives and didn't ask the right questions to the military. The planning, programming, and budgeting system was put in place for supplying the military in time of peace, but was applied here to war. Contrarily to the economic approach, in war you want an excess of means to win, not the minimum required. Because of the Johnson administration's policy, they didn't try to win by beating the North Vietnamese, but rather by not losing in South Vietnam. And at this game, the North Vietnamese were more patient. There were several reasons for this. As we saw the myth of neutrality for Laos and Cambodia, there was the gradual nature of the war which promoted inertia, there was an inability to distinguish what the South could and should do by itself, and the limits of what foreign aid could bring. And most of all, the fear of Chinese intervention like in Korea. But contrarily to the Korean case, China was never threatened by invasion on the Vietnam side. As we saw, Mao in 1964 and 65 didn't want to get involved in defending the North, and the Cultural Revolution put the country on its knees. That is why requests by Westmoreland to strike communist bases in Laos and Cambodia were refused, as well as a plan by Southern General Cao Van Vien to operate in those countries and land in the North. Instead of defending a small border, they had to defend the South's enormous border. It's a bit like trying to scoop water out of a boat instead of plugging the hole. At one point you get tired. The military leaders meanwhile were guilty of underestimating their enemy and bowed to the politicians' refusal, thinking they could win even with a poor strategy. None of them offered a resignation. The Americans stayed in strategic defensive as an end to itself and waited for the events. The military was constrained to wage a war of attrition, which was blamed on Westmoreland and required patience, which the Americans had in short supply. Westmoreland was criticized mostly for focusing on large enemy units in mobile operations, but in reality, as soon as the Americans dispersed their troops, the communists attacked them with superior forces. They thus needed to hunt large enemy units with conventional forces before attacking dispersed guerrillas. On top of problems with unity of command in Washington, it was the same for the theater of operations. Strategic HQ was in Hawaii, Westmoreland's authority was confined to South Vietnam, their war in the North and pacification were separated from conventional war. Some directives came from Honolulu and others from Washington. For the North Vietnamese, the strategy was clear, and they never gave up their objective of conquering the South, whatever the delays and costs. They had for this their regular forces as well as the Viet Cong in the South. For the Communists, struggle was a key concept, with armed struggle which included combat, assassination and kidnapping, and political struggle which included manipulating international perception, destroying the South by non-military means, and administrating liberated zones. Some like Tonkin favored political struggle, while others like Le Duan wanted large battles. Hanoi's focus would change several times during the war. Revolutionary guerrilla from 1959 to 1965, with political struggle to weaken Saigon's authority. From 1965 to 68, armed struggle to confront American power, which led to many defeats and losses. From 68 to 72, a return to more political struggle before the offensive of 1972, another failure. And finally, from 1972 to 75, a focus on political struggle with a return to armed struggle in 1974 until victory. A good example of poor war management by Washington is Operation Rolling Thunder, the bombing campaign on North Vietnam which began in March. It was a progressive bombing campaign with a strategic persuasion goal of making Hanoi cease its actions and stop the flow of men and material to the south. The theory behind Rolling Thunder was graduated response, so the idea that by progressively intensifying the bombings and offering halts, Hanoi would notice the pattern and cease its actions. McNamara hoped to convey a message of strength to restraint. Obviously, the communists didn't understand why the Americans didn't use all their power, with only one strike per week at the beginning, and took advantage of halts to rebuild stronger. US military leaders said that if force was to be used, it should be with full intensity, not to send a political message based on social science theories. Johnson and Rusk responded that a too intensive air campaign would bring a Chinese intervention. On top of limiting the intensity, McNamara determined for each strike the target, the day, the time, the number of attack, the direction of attack, the planes and the munitions used. President Johnson even boasted that the aviation couldn't bomb an outhouse without his approval. Planes couldn't go beyond the 19th parallel, couldn't use their initiative and strike opportunity targets, and air reconnaissance was forbidden. Strikes in Laos on the Ho Chi Minh Trail followed the same pattern. They had to be approved 2 weeks in advance, to be within 200 meters of the trail, and attacks on secondary targets were forbidden. Until 1967, military leaders weren't involved in selecting targets. The Air Force and Navy were frustrated, especially since the Secretary had the guts to criticize them for a lack of results. Only a few transport infrastructure and military barracks were hit. 2 months and 10 days after the beginning, the President suspended Rolling Thunder and gave Hanoi a signal for negotiations. Hanoi rejected it and used the time to intensify its own operations. It didn't make any sense. North Vietnamese airfields should have been struck first to paralyze their aviation, But Washington said the airfields were, quote, held hostage by the possibility of intensifying the bombings. Anti-air missile sites couldn't be attacked while they were under construction by fear of hitting the Soviets putting them in place. The North Vietnamese anti-air system would become the most important in the world since World War II. For the North Vietnamese aviation, the objective was not so much destroying enemy planes, knowing it would be impossible to establish air superiority, but to force the Americans to abandon their mission and make them jettison their bombs. The Americans realized they were not prepared for air combat. Before the war, focus was on nuclear strikes, pilots were not trained in dogfights, and their planes were not well equipped for it. Their missiles lacked reliability, and they often didn't have cannons to compensate. After the first bombing halt from May 13 to 18, Rolling Thunder was extended up to the 20th parallel and increased to 2 strikes a week. The Pentagon was obsessed with numbers, pushing the services to do sorties for the sake of it, to bomb jungle and say they were trucks, and to do sorties with only 1 bomb per plane. Pilots were cynical because their lives were at stake. Bombings were stopped again from Christmas 65 to January 31st, 1966. Graduated response sent the opposite message of what was intended, and Hanoi saw a lack of American will. Military leaders wanted to strike real targets in North Vietnam instead of only barracks. McNamara and his team were convinced by statistics that they were on the right track, but they were unable to measure things like national determination and individual fighting spirit. There were several issues with the US Navy also, with old equipments used to the bone and exhausted crews. For Rolling Thunder in 1965, 180 American planes were lost. After the war, General Diab said, "We always knew we would have to cease the struggle the day the B-52s arrived over Hanoi. But that wouldn't be the case until 1972, too late." For the air war in the South, meanwhile, we often hear that bombings were indiscriminate, with free fire zones, but that wasn't always the case. They needed authorization from forward air controllers to designate targets, and from local political leaders to bomb. In Vietnam, only a few non-inhabited zones under enemy control were free fire zones, while ironically during World War II, the Just War, all Europe was a free fire zone. The Ho Chi Minh Trail has been one of the most important elements of the war, and completely underestimated by Washington at the time. The North Vietnamese always denied their presence in the South, saying it was a People's Revolutionary War, and many in the West believed that. They initially had a 30,000-man force to convert trails to a road network. At the beginning it was dirt roads with 6-month transit, while in 1975 it took less than a week and consisted of 20,000 kilometers of roads, 5,000 kilometers of pipelines, and 10,000 transport vehicles. In addition to logistics, it gave the communists faster interior lines than the South to quickly concentrate their men. The trail was complemented by a route going from the port of Sihanoukville to the Vietnamese border. Only in 1969 under Nixon, the Americans would hit communists in Cambodia and remove this possibility. Advocates of air power were arguing as usual that they could solve everything by themselves and destroy the trail, but Operation Steel Tiger, Tiger Hound, and Commando Hunt only managed to slow it. Each request by Westmoreland to send troops to block the trail was refused. Only in 1971 there was an attempt by the South Vietnamese, which led to an important battle. To get back on the situation on land, as we saw, the 1st Marine Battalions landed in Da Nang on March 8. In the new government in Saigon, Ky had the power as PM and Thieu had the symbolic role as head of state. Ky was young and flamboyant, while Thieu was little known but respected by the nationalists for his administrative skills and his discretion. On May 11, the NLF launched its largest offensive yet, and the summer was the low point for the South Vietnamese army. The RVN was on the defensive and losses and desertions were high. The communists executed the wounded by firearms or knives. Westmoreland proposed to Washington a plan for the Americans with their firepower to concentrate on large enemy units in search and destroy operations, while the South Vietnamese, better at relations with the population, would protect them from the guerrilla. The RVN up until then had to fight large enemy units. It made sense, but his approach was criticized by counterinsurgency enthusiasts for its focus on conventional war. Contrarily to what many said, It wasn't a struggle for the civilian population's loyalty anymore. Search and destroy operations were essential to protect South Vietnamese pacification efforts, but we retained an image of patrols in the jungle and mindless property destruction, which wasn't the case most of the time. The use of body counts, so counting enemy deaths because McNamara absolutely wanted to quantify success, also gave the war a bad image. Hanoi wanted to launch an assault with its troops to take coastal cities. The 325A Division launched its attack on the Kon Tum Pleiku zone and aimed to break southern forces. Westmoreland finally was authorized on June 26 to use its troops in battle. Neither Washington nor Hanoi had initially predicted this situation. The MACV commander asked for 270,000 men, and Johnson only agreed to a small part to continue minimizing the war. All of it was an enormous logistical effort, because they had to carry all these men and equipment across the world, supply the RVN, in the country which lacked infrastructure. On August 18, the Marines launched Operation Starlight on the coastal town of Van Thuong, held by the North Vietnamese. The defenders established their positions near civilians, hoping to avoid fire from heavy weapons, but the Americans ultimately chose to attack them instead of risking their own losses. It was the same thing as any other war, and as in the others, wounded civilians were later treated by American medics. One of the Marines fired on enemy bodies to find fake dead. His commander, Captain Webb, told him to stop because it was inhumane. A few minutes later, an enemy faking death killed Webb with a grenade. Estimated communist deaths were 1,430, and the North Vietnamese High Command ordered that its main units wouldn't hold coastal towns anymore. They now had to base themselves in difficult terrain. American losses were 45 dead and 203 wounded. Operation Starlight showed the effectiveness of American intelligence, mobility, and firepower. The strongest element in American firepower was aircraft. The big innovation of the war was the intensive use of air mobile operations. There were specialized divisions, converted paratrooper divisions, and other divisions transported by helicopter. The North Vietnamese meanwhile had the great ability to move on foot without detection and strike by surprise. There was in this war at the beginning a large presence of journalists who reported each case of damage on civilians by the Americans. In Cam Ranh on August 3, 51 huts were destroyed in the fighting. Correspondents reported that the Marines destroyed 150 houses and were ordered to raze the village. Journalists had already poorly represented South Vietnamese forces, but never American soldiers before. Most of the press was favorable to the war, but negative reports would become more common. The most important issue remained the use of Laos and Cambodia by the North Vietnamese. The JCS again recommended operating on these territories to prevent infiltrations, intensifying rolling thunder, and mining ports in the north. China at that point said it would only fight if invaded, but Johnson and McNamara refused the recommendations by talking about the risk of escalation. McNamara said that if the United States prevented themselves from striking North Vietnam with massive force, communist powers would also show restraint. As I already mentioned, the Indonesian domino continued to fall towards the communist side in the summer, with Sukarno talking about the Jakarta, Peking, Pyongyang, Hanoi, Phnom Penh axis, of blocking the Straits of Malacca to fight against imperialism, and declared that non-revolutionary citizens could not exist in the country. He attempted on October 1st a purge of generals to avoid the coup d'etat, but underestimated General Suharto, who was encouraged by anti-communist efforts in Vietnam and crushed the conspiracy. Suharto ended up taking power and removed Sukarno, securing the biggest domino in the region. In early August, northern divisions were prepared to rush towards the coast to cut the country in half. Westmoreland anticipated it. The South Vietnamese managed to block them, and the North Vietnamese realized that a rapid conquest was now impossible and adopted a strategy of attrition to weaken American political will. After a failed attempt to take the Playmay base on October 19, Northern General Chu Yiman decided to withdraw his troops to the Ia Dang Valley to recuperate. Westmoreland decided to pursue them with the 1st Cavalry Division. Rarely was a pursuit so devastating. Operation Starlight and this pursuit of the Playmay became the most well-known search and destroy operations in the beginning of the war. But they weren't the only victories of this kind. In mid-September in Binh Dinh during Operation Gibraltar, the Americans defeated the 2nd NVA Regiment. They counted 226 enemy bodies and lost 13 dead and 26 wounded. By the end of October, American tactical victories had removed the immediate threat, so they could concentrate on the long term. The The weakened North Vietnamese remains were reinforced in Nha Dang by a freshly arrived regiment. They prepared for a new attack, but were intercepted by a battalion of Colonel Moore's 7th Cavalry on November 14. The Americans were outnumbered and their troops arrived piecemeal by helicopter. The North Vietnamese launched massive assaults on Moore's positions, but without success, and ended up withdrawing after several days. The Americans found 634 bodies on the ground and estimated 1,215 more losses. They lost 79 killed and 121 wounded. The power of their heavy weapons inflicted enormous casualties, and infantrymen showed their capabilities. Other American battalions went to battle afterwards in landing zone Albany. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was an inexperienced unit which didn't take precautions, and in the battle lost 151 killed and 121 wounded out of 500 men. They counted 403 enemy bodies. Hanoi of course proclaimed Nha Dang as a heroic victory, and only decades later they would admit it had devastated their forces militarily and psychologically. The units lacked food and discipline was crumbling. Remaining northern units withdrew to Cambodia, but the Allies couldn't pursue. Morale was generally good among Americans, but the large media presence put losses on the big screen. Victory in Vietnam remained hard to measure. The Americans couldn't leave occupational forces, but they prevented the North Vietnamese from attaining their objectives. With technological abundance, there was a dependence on firepower, and this dominated tactical thoughts and techniques. During the advisory period, the South Vietnamese were criticized for wanting to wait for air support instead of charging, but here the Americans did the same thing. Units practically became reconnaissance to call for air support. Despite that, communist troops kept their mobility. They disengaged often, and pursuit was a forgotten art for the Americans. As British strategist Robert Thompson said, if the Americans suffered low losses in battles, those were wasted because their tactics let the enemy leave. There were about 80 major communist strongholds in the south and hundreds of minor ones, and it was often difficult to find them and destroy them. At the same time as Nha Dang, there were battles just as important, but less mediatized and thus less well known. In the Binh Duong province, an infantry battalion of the 2nd Division, led by Colonel Schoffer, fought almost the entire Ninh NVA division, 10 times more men. Schoffer had to bomb enemy mortars entrenched in a civilian hamlet to prevent an attack. Ninh Division losses, hard to estimate, led it to abandon its attack plans on the capital of Dao Tien district. The Americans lost 20 dead and 26 wounded. Le Duan and General Nguyen Chi Tan pushed for larger direct confrontations and ignored the advice of Giap and others who wanted guerrilla. They remained optimistic, by ideology and because field commanders constantly talked about their victories against the Americans, despite reality. There were several confrontations where the North Vietnamese defeated South Vietnamese units before getting beaten by the Americans. The RVN did better in Fort Corps, the Mekong Delta, with the absence of Americans. General Dan Van Quang fought the communists several times in the last months, and peasants, always aligning with the stronger side, went in large part to the government side. At the end of 1965, search and destroy operations removed the initiative for the North Vietnamese in most of the country. Westmoreland estimated communist losses for the year at 35,000 killed and 6,000 captured. American losses were 1,378 killed, 6,148 wounded, and 143 missing or captured. The South suffered around 14,000 killed, most of them before August. The Allies tended to overestimate communist losses, but this was often compensated by those they missed, as the communists would often take their dead and wounded with them when withdrawing. The North Vietnamese continued however to generate fighters, and MACV analysts underestimated enemy forces. According to Northern Statistics, almost 47,000 North Vietnamese were infiltrated in 1965 compared to 17,000 the previous year. They had 5 divisions on the spot. Southern forces could not be suddenly increased as their system was already stretched and they lacked good leadership. Westmoreland wanted to compensate by inflicting more losses, but wasn't confident in his capabilities. At the end of October, he asked McNamara to increase forces to 400,000 by the end of 1966, far more than the 270,000 he talked about in July. The Joint Chiefs warned the president he would have to call the reserve for that, but Johnson instead agreed to a plan by McNamara to bypass the reserve by recruiting more inexperienced youth, despite the fact this diminished forces quality. McNamara refused JCS recommendations to operate in Cambodia, saying there were few proofs of enemy presence. Military leaders were forbidden to talk to the press about the North Vietnamese in Cambodia, which outraged the troops who were fighting these same enemies who retreated there. The last internal debate of the year was about suspending Rolling Thunder. Those in favor said it would bring Hanoi to negotiate, even though Hanoi never showed any interest in this. The JCS, Westmoreland and Admiral Sharp were united in opposition to a halt. Even Lodge, who was back as ambassador, was against. Chiu said it would only allow Hanoi to rebuild, but the Americans didn't take Saigon's opinion into account. Le Duan clearly said in a speech in December that he was for the war until the disintegration of the South Vietnamese army and American capitulation. Like Thieu and Ky, Le Duan wanted victory. Johnson finally decided on a bombing halt starting on December 24. Johnson, at the beginning of 1966, pushed for his peace offensive, with negotiator Averell Harriman ready for anything to reach peace, without consulting military leaders. The North Vietnamese remained uncompromising and would only accept an American capitulation. The Americans allowed for several weeks' pause, and Johnson hesitated to resume. The JCS and other military leaders wanted a bombing renewal with the removal of restrictions, but the president remained convinced by McNamara and his whiz-kids that it wouldn't change anything. In reality, North Vietnamese logistics were really hurt by the bombings, and their forces in the south lacked resources for operations. McNamara began doubting chances of victory in the war and was ready to compromise the southern government's integrity. Only with a Senate inquiry, the president agreed to intensify the bombings in 1967. Westmoreland planned for 1966 to penetrate enemy bases, destroy major units, and secure population centers and main roads. The North Vietnamese for their part had a strategy for 1966 to focus on large forces and attack everywhere to disperse Allied forces and make the South Vietnamese unable to defend Saigon. Because of logistical shortages, however, attacks were delayed. The communists around Saigon in the Third Corps region decided to avoid combat, except on February 24 when the 9th Division attacked by surprise an American force, ending in a crushing communist defeat. The Americans wanted to avoid losses and bombed hamlets where the communists were entrenched. They asked civilians to evacuate, but there were obviously civilian casualties and the communists accused them of deliberate massacres. North Vietnamese forces moved from the mountains to the coast in the Quang Thi and Thu Thien provinces, but after hard fighting in March, they had to give up. Westmoreland still pushed to send troops for blocking infiltrations in Laos and Cambodia, but McNamara and Ross still refused. The South was politically more stable with Ky and Thieu, who didn't bow to Thi Quang's subversive demands, especially since Ky himself was a Buddhist. There were still demonstrations, and the communists had agents with mission to bring division between Saigon and Washington. The two leaders managed to affirm the central authority and could concentrate on nation building. American journalists were still critical of Saigon, and Lodge, who previously participated in the destruction of Diem's government, now criticized the journalists for accepting without question militant Buddhist claims. Neil Sheehan and other journalists talked about a catastrophic situation for the government, which was completely false. The government organized elections for a constituent assembly and supplied financing for candidates. The NLF meanwhile threatened to kill anyone who would participate. The elections were validated by international observers, and the winners represented all groups in the country, with 81% participation. There was still debate on the constitution to write. There would be in 1966 an acceleration in pacification. Rural security would allow growth in the South in 1967, which in turn would allow the country to hold against the Tet Offensive in 1968. The American person in charge for pacification, Robert Comer, was for firstly ensure security, for then allowing to persuade people to support the government by distributing goods and services, then by improving local governance. Thieu and Ky agreed, but were careful. The communists continued to assassinate local representatives, although less than the previous year, and attack refugee centers. From June 1964 to June 1966, there were 1 million refugees, and despite government efforts, conditions were abysmal. For soldiers on both sides, the main adversaries in normal times were traps, disease, leeches, heat, rain, bad officers, lack of sleep, and boredom. They had joined their military often for their country, but ended up fighting for their bodies. American public opinion, military leaders, and the CIA were for an increase in bombings, but the State Department remained firmly opposed, with the same argument about escalation. In reality, China continued to indicate it would not intervene, and tension among communist powers worsened. Moscow began winning influence in Hanoi at the expense of Beijing. Edouin said the USSR was his second fatherland. China kept its 300,000 men in the north, but cut material aid as punishment. In South Vietnam, the 324th North Vietnamese divisions entered by the demilitarized zone in May to attack Marines in jungle combat. There were several more fights where large northern units were repulsed with big losses by smaller American units. The North Vietnamese leadership continued debating the right strategy, with Tan saying large battles were working well and Giap for returning to guerrilla. Key decisions in Hanoi were made by a Politburo subcommittee which included Le Duan, Le Duc Tho, Van Tien Dung, Pham Hung, and Giap. They voted in June to keep the strategy of conventional attrition and planned two increases in attacks, in November 1966 and in March 1967, with a decisive victory planned for late 1967. The debate on Rolling Thunder evolved in the summer, with McNamara finally realizing the importance of attacking northern petroleum installations. The North Vietnamese anticipated that and had already dispersed their depot, often near villages to avoid airstrikes. Johnson ended up agreeing on large oil sites in the Hanoi-Haiphong area, but refused to lift other restrictions. Bombs hit their targets on the depots. This enraged the North Vietnamese and delighted American prisoners, who were often tortured, degraded, and deprived of everything in violation of signed accords. Hanoi hoped to gain military intelligence as well as crime confessions, supporting the propaganda saying that Rolling Thunder deliberately aimed at civilians. In reality, American pilots took more risks to avoid hitting civilians. The Johnson administration refused to do like its predecessors in World War II and forbade hitting civilian centers. The number of civilian deaths for Rolling Thunder, so from March 1965 to November 1968, is estimated at 50,000. A torture method favored by the North Vietnamese was strapado, which cut blood circulation in the limbs. Other torture methods included whips and drowning, and several prisoners were unable to resist and ended up talking. Jeremiah Denton, who had resisted torture for several days, capitulated, but in a filmed confession on May 2, 1966, he blinked his eyes in Morse code to communicate torture. The POL campaign didn't have the wanted radical effect because of depot dispersion. The North Vietnamese could still store enough oil to fuel its war effort in the south. The POL strikes rallied more Americans behind expanding bombings though, and approval for the conduct of the war rose from 42 to 54%. The debate on Cambodia continued. The MACV said that communist supplies in this country were important, while the CIA said that the communists were mostly getting their supplies in South Vietnam. The government of course listened to the opinion it wanted to hear, but in reality, even the MACV underestimated the importance of Cambodia for the communists. It allowed for bringing guns and mortars, and hundreds of thousands of tons of rice. Despite that, the North Vietnamese struggled to feed their troops, who had to cultivate manioc along the trail. The 7th Division notably remained out of action for several months because of a lack of rice. In August, the Australians fought the North Vietnamese in Operation Sheffield. The wet season prevented airstrikes, but they used artillery well. North Vietnamese losses were 800 dead and 1,000 wounded, while the Australians lost 17 dead and 21 wounded. In the Central Islands, a communist regiment went against a US-Korean joint force and lost 700 dead. In the Quang province, an American Vietnamese force attacked Division 324B in Operation Hastings. Westmoreland wanted to strike its logistical bases, which were in the DMZ, but the State Department said it couldn't use B-52s because it could seem like an escalation. The Marines repulsed the division to the border and inflicted large casualties. There was a lull after the communist defeats in fall, but Hanoi planned new offensives. McNamara began to lose confidence in the war and wanted a new bombing campaign to stimulate negotiations. He wrongfully said that Rolling Thunder didn't have an influence on infiltrations. The secretary wanted to find alternative means of blocking infiltrations and pushed the idea of a high-tech barrier designed by academic scientists with many sensors to detect enemies. His barrier, nicknamed McNamara Line by the military, never really worked despite all the effort put into it. Military leaders repeated that they should lift restrictions on Rolling Thunder instead. Even though there had been 3 times more bombs dropped than the previous year, the targets hit were the same. The JCS mostly wanted to strike airfields and ports. 85% of the North supplies passed through the port of Haiphong. Even other countries of the region called for intensifying the bombings, but the president and secretaries were opposed, saying that too much bombing would prevent negotiations. McNamara's other initiative was reorganizing pacification according to Comer's ideas, which aimed to centralize the effort under military control because security came before everything else. The Joint Chiefs and Westmoreland agreed, but not the civilian departments. On October 2, the Americans, South Vietnamese, and South Korean began Operation Irving in the Binh Dinh province. Westmoreland has stricter rules for bombings, which had to be approved by Southern leaders, but that gave the enemies time to react. At the end of Irving on the 24th, the 1st Cavalry Division had killed 683 men, for 22 dead. The winter offensive wanted by the Politburo began in mid-October at the Cambodian border. Proximity with sanctuaries offered protection and access to supplies. In the region north of Saigon, which was a priority for Hanoi, operations began in November. After days of combat, the North Vietnamese left the area, leaving 1,106 bodies. Westmoreland expected a North Vietnamese offensive from the DMZ and wanted to defend the area and bomb enemy forces there, but didn't get the authorization. The South Vietnamese army meanwhile suffered leadership issues, especially with heavy losses among young officers who couldn't gain experience. There was also a lack on the civilian side of administrators and cadres to manage liberated zones. Many competent leaders had been killed in the last years or removed for their support for Diem. Despite that, the government controlled 1 million more people at the end of 1966 than in mid-1965. Civilians continued to leave communist areas for government areas. North Vietnamese forces were increasingly confined to Laos and Cambodia, and General Tan was really glad the Americans refused to go there. In China, Mao began the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which would lead to millions of deaths. The North Vietnamese realized that China wasn't so much a model and were getting closer to Moscow. Rolling Thunder was hurting them, and Ho Chi Minh explicitly said to the Politburo on October 18 that they should negotiate to take advantage of a pause to bring supplies in the south. Johnson announced a concession with a partial bombing limitation on December 24 and called for a similar limitation of North Vietnamese actions in the south. Rolling Thunder still suffered from the same restrictions and the same ridiculous micromanagement from Washington. Even if attacks on petroleum objectives had a limited effect, North Vietnamese supply problems were much worse than what McNamara believed. Former President Eisenhower didn't understand why Johnson left sanctuaries, but the president didn't listen to his advice or the military's. Practically all insurgencies since World War II had external sources of aid. Westmoreland couldn't cut the problem at its source, so a prolonged war of attrition was unavoidable. We'll see in the next video how this led to more problems in 1967 and 68, and how the American administration suffered a failure in leadership and missed opportunities.